Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this important program. I'm Dan Kuntz, MOCPA's Senior Director of Professional Development. What we have experienced the past few months almost seems surreal. And as CPAs, many of you have had to maintain focus on the economic viability of your organization and those of our clients, and the long-term impact on our business community. But throughout all of this, we can't lose sight of our shared humanity and the impact we are each personally feeling. As we've gathered virtually with members in learning events, meetings, and roundtables, a common theme in discussion is the mental toll the past few months have taken on everyone. As a result, we have developed a resource page on our MOCPA website with mental health information. We have published an article in the July Asset and are hosting complimentary webinars such as the one today to offer ways to help you and your colleagues cope. We are all here to learn and grow together. Now, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, Karla. Karla is a health management consultant with Marsh and McLennan Agency. She will be providing us with a deeper understanding of how stress impacts our lives and teach us techniques to increase resiliency and reframe stressful situations. Karla, I'm going to turn it over to you now. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Dan. And I'd like to welcome everybody to the session as well. And thank you for taking time on your day to join the session. It's a really important topic, as Dan mentioned. Mental health has been an area that we've been focused on quite a bit. And with COVID, certainly we're seeing more and more the need to focus on mental health. So we think about 2020, it's certainly been a year full of changes. We're all experiencing new challenges, a lot of new stresses that we were not anticipating we'd experience when we started the year. And we're really just being asked to do things a lot differently. So we think about our jobs, we're being asked to do our jobs differently. We have new deadlines, new rules that have come into play. Even the way that we shop and socialize with our friends, all that's looked really different this year. So what we thought was normal last year looks very different than what we're kind of considering our normal this year. And as we look into the future, it's really hard for us to know what normal will look like in just a few months, let alone if we think about this time next year, what the new normal is going to look like. And so really that just creates a lot of questions. It creates a lot of uncertainty. And even though we've all at some point in our life had to navigate a lot of change, all the changes that we're seeing and the pace that we're seeing them, it's really created a lot of increased stress, a lot of anxiety, and we're finding a lot of folks starting to just have some fears about what the future holds. So it's really important for us to take some time to talk about this. So during the session today, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about stress, talk about how it impacts our health, and then we're going to shift our focus and discuss resiliency, and then just talk about how our mindset can actually help us manage stress. And it's really, we'll find that it's really important to think about how you think about stress and how it provides you the ability to manage it. And then we're going to wrap up with really focusing on some strategies and providing a few resources that can help you as you really are on your journey to boost resiliency. So let's just start with talking about stress. So we've all heard of stress. We all have our own definition of what we think stress is. But as you think about stress, what are some words that if you had to describe it, if I were to say, how would you describe stress? What are some words that come to mind? And so again, just kind of in your mind, think about that. When I've taught classes before and I've actually asked those questions, the words that I hear are things like tension, strain, pressure. I've also heard people describe stress as things like feeling overwhelmed, being mentally drained, being anxious, exhaustion. And people have even gone to the point of saying, I feel like stress creates discomfort or pain for me. So it gets to a point where they're feeling discomfort. So generally speaking, when we talk about stress, most people will identify stress as something negative that they experience. And if you think about it, if you actually would go out to the dictionary or Google stress, the definitions that come up are something similar to this definition, which is stress is defined as physical, mental, or emotional factor that causes bodily or mental tension. So again, that definition really seems to align with what our general perception of stress typically is. And that's really that it's something negative or harmful to us. So, every day we experience different kinds of stress. And, again, over the last few months, those stressors have been different than what we've experienced in the past. But this image of this rubber band is kind of a nice way to think about it. So if you think about that rubber band, we can pull on it and stress that rubber band. But generally, in most cases, that stress that we put on that rubber band, it's not going to break the rubber band. That rubber band will generally come back to its normal size and shape, and it can generally withstand all those stresses that we're placing upon it. But what if we stretch that rubber band a little bit further? We don't ever let it go back to its resting point. We just keep stretching and stretching to a point where either that rubber band no longer returns to its shape or it snaps. Then stress can become a challenge. So if we think about that image and then think about how you and your body reacts to stress, it can be a lot like the example of a rubber band, right? If we have the appropriate coping skills, if we have resources in place, if we have a really strong support system, our bodies generally will recover from whatever stresses that we're experiencing from day to day. But just like that rubber band, if we're continually bombarding our bodies with stress, and then the stresses are exceeding our coping mechanisms, we no longer have the resources to help support us or that support system in place to help us manage that stress, we too can reach that point where that stress can have a negative physical impact on our health. So, we've all heard headlines. I think if I were to ask you, is stress hard on your health? And we've been told over and over again that, that too much stress can have a negative impact on our health. So it's really not a surprise to any of us that chronic negative stress can ultimately have a negative impact on our overall health and well-being. So I just want to take, a little bit of time just to explore what happens to our bodies when we encounter stress. So you've all heard, I'm sure at one point in time, whether it was, junior high science class, about the fight or flight response. And so, when we're threatened or we experience some sort of stress, our nervous system automatically kicks in and responds by releasing a set of hormones, the stress hormones that you've probably heard of, like adrenaline and cortisol. These hormones are really designed to signal to our bodies that we have to prepare for some sort of emergency action. So you'll notice things like your heart will beat faster, you might have some more tension and tightness in your muscles, your blood pressure will rise, your respiration rate increases, your senses get sharper. And really, when we think about why our body is doing this, it's because these physical changes, they're really designed to help increase our strength, to increase our stamina, help us speed up our reaction time, and really just kind of enhance our focus in general. And essentially what's happening is we're preparing our bodies to either fight or flee from some sort of danger at hand. So if we think about, our ancestors from a long time ago, this type of response was really important to help protect them from predators. Maybe they were out on the thrill of a hunt because they had to find food for survival. So when they would go through that process during that fight or flight, the stress hormones that were kicked out, that cortisol and that adrenaline, they all get used up and replaced by a set of hormones that actually cause the body to relax. And so that new set of hormones, they're designed to help kind of restore balance back in our body and put us into something called homeostasis. And again, if thinking back to your biology classes, that homeostasis is something that the human body likes to be in balance. So without this kind of response, you think back to our ancestors, they'd be in a whole world of trouble, right? They needed to have this type of response. But now if you think about, kind of fast forwarding to our world today, and if you think about the stress that, we all face every day, those stresses are really different than what our ancestors encountered. So we don't generally find ourselves, really face to face with a saber-toothed tiger. We don't necessarily have to be out hunting for food for survival. And so those emotional threats that we have are really the types of threats that we face today. That's our stressors. Again, very different than those physical threats that our ancestors would have experienced. So the problem really comes in is that our nervous system is really not good at determining the difference between whether it's an emotional threat, whether it's a physical threat. And so if you're really stressed because perhaps you had an argument with a friend, maybe there's some sort of work challenge that you faced and it's creating some stress, maybe there's some financial strain, whatever that stress might be, your body's going to react just as strongly as if you were facing a true life or death situation. So similar to, being the prey of a predator, right? That same response. And so the more that emergency stress system is activated, your body actually gets really good at triggering that stress response. You become more proficient at it. And so that really makes it harder for that stress system to shut off. And in some cases, it may not shut off at all. You might always be kind of in that constant state of stress response. So if you tend to get stressed out, again, and thinking about our demanding world, there are a lot of stressors that are coming at us. Our body's going to potentially exist in this heightened state of stress for the majority of the time. It's just not that the relaxation hormones are not going to come out and help us get to that relaxation state. And when that happens, that's when we start to see the potential for some serious health impacts. So if you think about that chronic stress, it really can disrupt nearly every system in your body. So it can disrupt your immune system, which if you think about having a pandemic with a virus, we really want our immune system to be working optimally. It can upset your digestive system, reproductive systems, and it can also do things like increase the risk of heart attack, increase your risk of stroke, and even speed up the aging process in general. So the other thing that it can do, I think, which is kind of interesting, is it can actually rewire your brain. And so that rewiring can leave you more susceptible to things like anxiety, depression, or any other mental health challenge that you can think of. So again, important as we think about mental health, managing that stress and having those coping mechanisms in place. So I want to shift gears just a little bit because we've just talked about how stress can be a potential negative. But the question comes up, is stress always bad? So I think that's a pretty interesting question because remember when we started at the top, most of the time we're seeing people generally perceive stress as a negative. But the answer to that question is actually no. It turns out that certain levels of stress are actually beneficial to us. And so if you think about some stressors, stress can actually enhance our performance. It can improve our memory. It can help us focus our attention more, again, which is very important for performance. It can also make us stronger. So an example that I like to share, and sometimes people, it's kind of an aha moment, is to think about exercise. Exercise is actually a stressor. So if you think, for example, of strength training, you go to the gym, you're lifting some weights, and the goal is to get stronger. Well, in order for those muscles to grow stronger, you actually create some muscle fiber damage. You break them down and create stress on those muscles, and then they actually build stronger. So if you think about it, exercise as a stressor, and I think we would probably describe it as positive if I were to ask you, is it positive, can actually help improve your strength over the long term. And that's the same thing if you do cardiovascular exercise, improving your heart function as well. And the other thing stress can do is help us build mental toughness. So, examples of this, think about if you have a loss in your life, maybe you've experienced some sort of loss, you've had an argument with a loved one, that experience and that stress that you go through, as you navigate that stress, you actually become stronger. It may help you appreciate life more, or it may actually strengthen that relationship to help build stronger connections. So, ultimately, if you look at this stress response curve, the reality is we do need to have some stress in our lives, right? So we are not ever going to be able to eliminate stress. And so we could talk about how to reduce stress, but the reality is we're not going to eliminate it. But there are certain points where we reach that stress might become overwhelming. It could become excessive, and really those benefits that we talked about start to disappear. And that's really where we start to see the challenges where fatigue, exhaustion, and burnout come into play. And you can see in this curve kind of where that beneficial point is, and then there's that point in the curve where we actually start to see some of those negatives that could come into play. So that's the stress response curve. So now that we know that stress isn't necessarily bad, can we start to think differently and take maybe a different perspective on how we view stress? So, one of the challenges about stress and defining is that it's really subjective. And so if you think about each individual, our personalities are just different. We have different personalities, different temperaments, and we may all be exposed to the same stressor, but our responses are going to be really different just based on our unique set of circumstances. And so an example of this is if you think about public speaking. Generally, if individuals are asked to speak in front of a large audience, there's generally going to be some level of stress or anxiety that comes up for most people. But if you think about certain individuals, there are some individuals who really almost shut down, and the fear is so great and overwhelming that getting up in front of that large audience is something that they just can't do or are very challenged to do. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have individuals who it seems like it almost energizes them. So if you think about that stress again, it's really hard to quantify because there's such a different response to it. So similarly, the stress curves, like in the slide that we just looked at, they're really different. So the point at which, I may have a breaking point where it becomes overwhelming is going to be different from somebody else, where that negative point of stress starts to impact somebody else. So Dr. Heidi Hanna, she is a brain researcher and she's also an author. And she proposes that, the feelings of stress can really just be viewed as energy. Or you can think of it as information, right? So take that stress and use it as an information to help us know when we might need to make some changes in our life. So it's a way to kind of assess and make adjustments to reduce our stress levels. So, for example, if you think about maybe a home life experience where maybe you're starting to work too much and you're not having enough time for your family, it's really that information that allows us to kind of prioritize our time, figure out where do we need to be spending our energy, and just using that as a way to help problem solve and adjust based on the stress that we're feeling. Okay, so now that we've talked about stress, we've defined stress, talked about the fact that, we aren't going to eliminate stress. Not all stress is bad. Let's shift a little bit and talk about how we handle stress and introduce the concept of resiliency. So I like to start with this cartoon because it really gives us the chance to think about, does our mindset influence how we feel? So again, the way we think can influence how we feel. So if you look at this cartoon, you've got 4 individuals, all 4 are in the same situation. They're waiting in a line to get on a bus. The bus is running late. And so if you look at the first gentleman, he is clearly a little upset that the bus is late. He looks like he maybe headed off to work and he's just not pleased that he could be late. The second woman in the green pants, she's also a little bit frustrated that the bus is late, but she's also not happy that there's a gentleman in front of her in line and the concern that perhaps he's going to steal the last seat and she's going to have to stand. Kind of the same story with that third individual. He is not happy the bus is late and perhaps he's going to have some challenges paying because he's got a 20 and not exact change for the bus fare. But then we get to the last little guy at the end and he couldn't be happier the bus is late. So in this case, maybe he's off to school. Being late for the bus means he gets to miss some time. So really excited about that. So this really just illustrates, kind of our set of circumstances and our unique perspective really kind of influences how we respond to stress. So again, as we talked about earlier, stress is everywhere. It can be beneficial to us, but if we're chronically stressed, certainly again, as a reminder, it can become harmful to our health. So I want you to just take a moment to think about individuals that and I think we all know somebody who seems to thrive on stress when others may get overwhelmed. So again, thinking of that public speaking scenario, thinking about a work scenario where the busier you get, the closer you get to that tax day deadline, where individuals start to have a lot of work, a lot of hours, but there are certain people that seem to thrive when they have that type of pressure. What type of traits do you think of when you think of those individuals who seem to thrive when there's a lot more pressure or work to be done? Think of in your mind, how would you describe those individuals? What traits do they exhibit? So if we were in a room together and we, did a little brainstorming exercise and we wrote down what those characteristics are, we'd probably come with quite a list. But I captured a few of the ones that I commonly see when I do this exercise in a group. So individuals who tend to thrive under stress, they tend to be optimistic. They tend to view change as an opportunity. So when they hit a hurdle, they don't necessarily look at the hurdle. It's more of looking at what's happening beyond the hurdle. How are they going to get beyond it? It's not a roadblock. It's just something that they need to navigate to get to the end results. They generally have the ability to adapt to change. So they're very adaptable. They tend not to dwell on things that they can't control. So instead, they focus their energy on what they do have control over. So it's almost like thinking about a survivor versus a victim mentality, right? What can I control and how can I invest that energy to be stronger in that area? And then when they're presented with challenges, they often look at their past experiences to help them build on successes that they may have had in the past and use that as really a confidence builder. So even though maybe they're assigned a new project that they've never done before, they don't necessarily fear that challenge. Instead, they look back and find common examples of how they may have navigated something similar and use those successes to help them become more confident in their ability to navigate a new challenge. And I think maybe one of the most important characteristics when I think of somebody who is resilient is that they are willing to seek support if they need it. So even the most resilient people need support once in a while. And so I think that's really important to notice that, you may be very resilient, but there are going to be times when a resilient individual may not feel 100% optimistic, or they may struggle a little bit, but they know how to reach out and seek support to get help through those times. So these characteristics are what we would represent as a resilient mindset. So individuals who have that resilient mindset, again, they tend to thrive during those times of change, any type of challenge or adversity, very similar to what we are all experiencing now. And they really have that ability to recover quickly from those difficult situations. And as a result, they're often growing or adapting due to those difficult experiences. So I think the good thing to note around resiliency is that we can all learn and we can become more resilient with practice and appropriate skills. So even, if you don't feel like your resiliency skills are strong now, you do have the capability to grow and become more resilient. So that's the positive side. So I want to shift to focus and talk a little bit more about this concept of mindset. This is actually kind of an interesting area of study, really looking at, again, can your mindset impact your level of resilience and your ability to manage stress? So there is a lot of research that has recently taken place and a lot of research that is still being done in this general area. And the answer to this question is really yes. Your mindset can be very powerful and they can have a very strong influence on your ability to manage stress. So a couple researchers that come to mind when we think about your mindset and stress management are Aaliyah Crum from Stanford, Sean Aker from Harvard. They really are leading researchers in this area. There are a lot of other researchers as well, and there's a lot of experiments that have been done to really evaluate the power of our mindset in response to how we determine our stress and how we respond to that stress. So I just want to share a couple of these studies because I think they're quite fascinating actually. So the first one I want to share is called the CounterClockwise Study. And this is done by researchers at Harvard. And so what they did is they hosted a week-long retreat for elderly men. And so the retreat was really focused on all things from 20 years ago. So they had television programming and it had programs that they would have seen 20 years ago. Any type of food that they ate, if there were newspapers displayed, they were from 20 years ago. Current events that were discussed were actually current events 20 years ago. And so everything was really centered around making them believe that they were living in a time when it was 20 years ago. So almost making them believe that they were 20 years younger. And so the interesting thing at the end of this week, the participants not only noticeably appeared younger, so they did take images of the picture of the group before and after, and they looked younger in that second photo. They also did some other tests and they found their hearing and memory improved. They had greater joint flexibility and they measured their grip strength before and after, and they actually were stronger at the end. So kind of interesting. So this would make you believe that if they thought that they were younger, it actually resulted in improved physiological changes. So kind of interesting. Another study was also done at Harvard, and this one was focused on housekeepers. And so they took 84 housekeepers, they recruited them from different hotels, and they split these housekeepers into two different groups. One group of employees were told that the nature of their job was actually good for them, that it promoted exercise and health benefits. So they were given examples of how many calories they would burn doing their job, what muscle groups they were working and how that could help build strength, and just really all those health benefits that they could earn just by doing their job. And the other group, they didn't get the same information. It was just business as usual, go about doing their job. So for the group that was told their work was actually exercise, in just 4 weeks, without any changes, they asked them not to change their exercise outside of work. They didn't change their diet. They didn't change their workload at all. But those individuals, their perception that they got exercise, they believe that they actually got more exercise than those who didn't participate in that group. And then when they measured weight, body fat, and blood pressure, they actually had significant reductions in all three of those measures with no changes again to their diet or other exercise. So this study seemed to indicate as well that these significant changes in physiological health were attributed almost primarily on mindset. So again, really powerful study just to show how powerful that mind is. And then I wanted to share just one last study, and this study is one that I would certainly sign up for. This one's out of Yale, and it's the MilkShake Study. And so what they did is they recruited individuals to drink milkshakes. So during the first week, participants were given a shake with a label. And so the participants could clearly see the label. It had 140 calories, no fat, or 0 added sugar. So pretty, healthy, not super exciting shake. But they were asked to drink that every day for the week. And then the next week they came in, and this time they were greeted not with that healthy shake, but they were given a shake with a label that said it contained 620 calories, 30 grams of fat, and 56 grams of sugar. So this one was really indulgent and tasty, according to the label. So in both circumstances, researchers measured a hormone level that is secreted in the gut, and it is secreted in response to your consumption of food. So this level of hormone will drop in proportion to the number of calories that you consume. So if you consume a really indulgent meal, your levels of this hormone are going to drop significantly. And that's really going to tell your brain that you're full. So stop eating, you're full. So can you guess what happened in this situation? And you might have guessed just based on the results of the last two studies. So when the participants had the first low calorie shake, their hormone levels really didn't drop all that much. But with that second indulgent one, that hormone level did drop. So it told the brain to stop eating, you're full. And so the interesting part of that is that the shakes were actually the exact same each week. So they all had the same amount of calories. It was just that they believed that they had a more indulgent shake week 2 than they did week 1. So really interesting. So the result in the hormone level seemed to be attributed to the change in their mindset and the simple belief that they were drinking more calories. So very interesting. So all these studies, again, there's many more similar studies out there like this, but they all seem to demonstrate just how impactful your mindset is when it comes to your health, when it comes to improving your performance and really even your psychological growth. So it's really interesting that mindset is very powerful too when it comes to how you can manage stress and how you convert that stress into something beneficial. So Stanford Mind and Body Lab, this is where a lot of this work is done, and they believe very strongly that your mindset does impact your stress response. And they have created kind of a 3-step guide to how you can adopt a stress enhancing mindset. So again, their goal, and if you do read some of the research, again, really focuses on that idea, again, that we're not going to eliminate stress. It's still going to be there, but we can change how we react to that stress. So the first step in their plan is really to see the stress. So see it first. So this step simply is recognizing and just really taking time to acknowledge that you're feeling some sort of stress. What is that stress you're feeling? And so when you actually take time to acknowledge stress and really put a label on it and kind of that conscious labeling of your stress, what you do is you actually change how your brain is processing the stress. So if you remember back to the beginning of our discussion, we talked about the fight or flight response, and we talked about how this was an unconscious reaction that just happens the moment we sense a stress. We really have no control over that. And that reaction takes place in the part of your brain, which is called the amygdala. And that response, again, it's unconscious, we can't control it. But once we consciously acknowledge that stress, we actually shift the processing of that stress to a different part of our brain called our prefrontal cortex. And this is the part of brain that really then allows us to reason, and ultimately then we can choose how we respond to that stress. So if we think about COVID, this step might really include taking the time to acknowledge what we're specifically worried about when it comes to COVID-19. So where is our stress actually coming from? Is it the fear of getting sick? Is the stress coming because we're worried about perhaps a loved one who might be in that high risk category? Are we worried about someone we care about who maybe they've been impacted financially? We know that a lot of people have been impacted financially by the crisis. So it's really taking time to identify and know what specifically is creating the stress. And then once we do that, we can then start to determine how best to respond and manage that stress. Step 2 is really owning it then. And it's really simply welcoming the stress. So again, we stress generally about things that we care about. So if we own the stress, we can take time to really recognize really what's behind the stress. What's the personal value or the motivation for that stress? Why do we care about that stress? And this can just help us understand, again, the meaning of the stress and how we can start to manage it. And then the final step is just using your personal value behind that stress, really just to connect deeply to the things that matter most. In other words, we can use that stress to help facilitate our purpose and use it to turn the stress into something positive. So again, it's you see the stress, own it, and use it to turn into something positive. Okay, and so as we kind of close out this section, I want you to just take a moment to think about a time when you had substantial personal or professional growth. This could be something related to work. It could be graduating from college, passing that CPA exam, whatever. It's just take a moment just to kind of think about what that time in your life when you had some sort of personal or professional growth. So in order to personally or professionally grow, so again, thinking of your example, did you experience struggle along the way? So that's an interesting question to answer. And then would you have had the same level of growth? It would have been possible without having some sort of stress or struggle. So I think these are just really important questions, again, to think about, that it's just a reminder that sometimes you have to go through that stress or that struggle in order to achieve that personal growth again. So again, it really just builds on that idea that stress is not necessarily a negative thing. It can actually be beneficial and help us become more resilient and stronger in the long run. Okay, so now I think we're going to shift a little bit here to talk about some strategies to boost your resiliency. So again, we've just spent some time talking about how powerful our mindset can be when it really comes to managing stress. So one way to build resilience is to develop what's called the growth mindset. So I want to just share a little bit on this slide. Dr. Carol Dweck is a psychologist and professor at Stanford University, and she really introduced this concept of growth mindset versus fixed mindset. And she has a book that you can certainly read to learn a little bit more about it. But essentially, individuals who are in a fixed mindset, they tend to believe that the basic qualities like intelligence or their talent are simply fixed traits that they're born with. So they spend their time documenting their intelligence and talent really instead of developing it, right? They have it, they're either smart and talented or they're not. And they believe that that talent alone really is what is essential for creating success in their life. These individuals tend to avoid challenges. They tend to give up easily. Sometimes they can feel threatened by the success of others. And oftentimes they dread failure because they feel it kind of limits or implies a limit toward their ability. On the other side of the spectrum, you've got the growth mindset. And these are people who really believe that their most basic abilities can be developed. So the harder they work, the more dedicated they are to trying to learn and continue to grow, the stronger their abilities are going to get. So they really have a view that creates a lot of love for learning, and it's, as a result, they're resilient because it's essentially important for their accomplishments. So individuals with a growth mindset, they tend to welcome challenges. They tend to see failure as an opportunity to grow and learn. So yep, they might, seek out a challenge. They might not succeed, but it's a learning opportunity versus a mistake or a failure. They believe that, their effort and attitude really determines their ability. So it's really about that, again, that mindset and their ability. And, they're willing to try new things and they like to try new things. And so these individuals with a growth mindset really tend to be more resilient and they have a greater capacity to change and manage stress. So again, really focusing on how can I build that growth mindset to help me become more resilient. So this slide I think is kind of an interesting slide to think about. So is your mind full or are you mindful? So just think about that for just a minute. So when your mind is full, you really cannot appreciate what's happening around you. So you generally have thoughts racing through your mind and you may be being pulled in multiple directions. You just don't have time to truly slow down and notice what's happening in the present moment. Conversely, when you're mindful, it gives you the chance to be self-aware, chance to focus on the present moment, and really gives you the ability to experience your environment with all your senses. So if you think about taking your dog for a walk, your dog's going to be pretty mindful and enjoying that experience, but are you mindful or are you mindful? So maybe think about that as you take your dog out for a walk if you have one. So mindfulness, really what it is a technique that focuses on focusing on one thing at a time. It helps you become aware of your emotions and acknowledge that they will not last forever. So even if you're experiencing an emotion that's negative, it's okay. You're not going to necessarily judge that, but it's really being mindful is allowing you to be present at that moment and understand kind of those emotions and things that you're feeling. So staying present in the moment is really when you think about mindfulness as a strategy. So there's a lot of research here again that shows that individuals who practice mindfulness can actually change the neural pathways of their brain. So I think this is really interesting. So for example, you focus on negative things all the time, your brain has actually become hardwired to train that, to think that way. So if you might start seeing things more negatively. And conversely, if you train your brain to focus on positive things, you can actually train your brain to focus on the positive. So you might start seeing the good things versus the bad. And so we can do that training intentionally through mindfulness and really training ourselves to focus on positive. So the advantages of changing those neural pathways again through mindfulness can help us control really how we respond to negative situations. It can also help us pay attention to our thoughts and recognize, whether our thoughts are positive or negative. And then once we really make a conscious choice on what those emotions are, we can deal with them more effectively. And it can kind of help us identify that. So you can practice mindfulness in a variety of ways. You can do it through meditation or guided imagery. Breathing, I'll share a slide with an example of a breathing exercise. Visualization, really just example could be just focusing on your happy place and thinking about all the senses that you think about what you hear, see, feel, taste, smell if you're at that place, just closing your eyes and visualizing that. Sometimes just taking a pause can be an effective way to kind of bring you back to what you need to focus on in the present moment. And really just paying attention to your senses is a good way, just again, to think about that present moment. What am I feeling at that moment? So one of the ways to practice mindfulness is, again, is through deep breathing exercise. And we won't go through this, but this is just a nice example to think about when you may be experiencing some anxiety. It's a great way to help kind of relax those muscles, trigger the relaxation response, and just help you regulate your stress and anxiety. So in this particular example, it's called the 4-7-8 breathing technique. You simply breathe in for 4 seconds, and then you hold that breath for 7 seconds, and then you slowly exhale for a count of 8 seconds. And you do this 4 times. And when you do this, you may find that you just notice a difference, that you become more relaxed, more calm. This can also help lower your blood pressure and even slow your heart rate down. So it's a great way, if you're feeling a little bit of anxiety, to just take that moment to do this deep breathing exercise. Another way to practice mindfulness is to try something called the 5-4-3-2-1 exercise. So again, what this is designed to do is really bring your mind to that present moment. And so again, you really want to focus on your breath. Again, so think about that slow, guided breathing. And then take time to acknowledge 5 things you see, 4 things you touch around you, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you smell, and 1 thing you can taste. So again, it's really making you focus on that moment and how you feel. So good. Another good way for that mindfulness moment, again, if you're feeling that anxiety or stress, or you just need to kind of calm things down, this is a great exercise to try. There are also meditation apps, and I'm sure that many of you have seen many of these apps before. This is a great way to try meditation. It's a great tool to help you stay consistent with mindfulness, because you can get reminders to go out and practice meditation. And it's nice to go out and try a few different ones, because what you might find is that a different voice or a different style might resonate more with you. But there are different styles of meditations depending on your specific situation. So if you're having a lot of anxiety, or if you need help sleeping, you can go out and try a meditation that's designed just for that. So this is just a sample. There are many more options that you can certainly try as well when it comes to meditation. So another thing I want to just focus on, so if you remember back when we talked about the characteristics of a resilient individual, one of the things we talked about was their ability to be optimistic and the capacity to manage their thoughts. And so one thing to think about is being able to reframe your thought. So again, we talked a little bit about, being able to perceive a situation, being able to kind of capture that emotion or that feeling through mindfulness. If, for example, if you think about when we go through a challenging time, oftentimes we generally see a situation that is creating change or adversity, and we often move right away to our initial perception of something negative, thinking negatively. So we think about kind of this concept of COVID-19, it changed for a lot of us the way that we did our work. And so initially there might have created some stress where we might have thought, okay, now my job tasks are gonna be a lot more challenging, because let's say I'm used to being in an office and now I'm being pushed to work from home remotely. I don't see my clients face to face. I don't see my coworkers. my tasks are going to be more difficult. I've got family at home, more distractions, and there's automatically kind of a negative perception. So the way reframing is to really kind of capture that negative thought and change the way that we think about something and view it in a different perspective. So in this case, it's consciously trying to see it in a positive light. So maybe it's looking for new opportunities to be creative or innovative. Maybe the positive is that I have new ways to connect, and maybe some of these new things that we came up with are going to be part of our new norm moving forward. And I've also heard as this pandemic's hit that a lot of individuals say, gosh, it's actually been kind of nice to work from home because now I don't have my commute time. I have more time to connect with my family and friends, and I have more time for that. So again, that reframing your thought is just a way when you think about being resilient is to capture, when we catch yourself thinking negatively, really just trying to find that silver lining and shift that thinking to something positive. And this can be challenging depending on the situation you're dealing with, but really how do we change that thinking and become more resilient? Another important characteristic is really around the ability to let go of the things you can't control. So we talked about this a little bit again in the resilient mindset section, that if we focus on things we cannot control, what often happens is we tend to worry, we tend to think about all these possible scenarios that might come into play, which create more anxiety, and we can imagine the worst possible scenarios that we could possibly come up with. It's really not productive. It creates unnecessary stress. And instead, we really want to take the time to kind of focus on those things that we can control. And so this image is just a nice way to think about, if we think about the COVID-19 experience, if you look at those things in the inner circle, those are the things that you can control. Things on the outside you can't control. And so again, it's really just taking those times, regardless of what scenario you're in, to stop and pause and identify what can I control, what can I control, and really focusing on your energy on those things that you can control. So again, this is a great way to think about how you can build some resiliency, controlling what you can control. Social connection. So this is another one that's pretty important. So when we think about a time when we're being asked to physically distance, our need to stay connected with our family and friends and coworkers is pretty important. So if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, once humans have really met their basic physiological and safety needs, so things like food and water, the next set of needs that you need are psychological. And those are really met through our relationships, our belonging with a group, and just generally feeling close and connected to people. So a lot of scientific evidence, including some of the work that Maslow did, really suggests that core psychological need has to happen in order for us to feel satisfied with our lives. There's also some research that shows that the lack of social connection can actually have a greater detriment to our health than obesity, smoking, and high blood pressure. So, we've all heard of the dangers of obesity, smoking, and high blood pressure. So imagining, that social connection can actually have a greater negative impact is a pretty powerful statement. Cigna did some research around loneliness, and what they found in a study that they did is that 45%, your odds of dying early are 40% higher if you don't have that social connection and if you're lonely. And it also found that the same amount of damage to your lifespan can be found as smoking 15 cigarettes. And again, that's just feeling lonely and not having that social connection. So again, very, very powerful. So these are just a few examples. I won't go through these, but again, there are a lot of ways that you can create and maintain social connections, even during the times when we're being asked to physically distance. And, there are some abilities to have more social connections now that things are opening up a little bit. But again, really taking that time to check in on your family and friends. Your colleagues, if you are a leader of an office, making sure that you're taking care of your employees and just checking in to make sure that people are okay. It's really, really important given this time just to make sure people feel connected. So gratitude, this is another great way to help build resiliency. So again, believe it or not, practicing gratitude actually has a pretty significant impact on your health. There's a lot of research out there that suggests that when you practice gratitude, you can get benefits such as improved sleep, enhanced immune systems, a lot of great, wonderful benefits. I'll just quickly go through the next slide here. A couple ways to practice gratitude really is just taking time to acknowledge the things that that you're grateful for. And so these are just a few exercises that you can try on your own. But again, just being able to capture those really helps build that gratitude and gets the benefits. Self-care, another really important action to help preserve your own health. And so these, again, give you some examples of ways that you can practice self-care. So if you think of the plane example, you really have to put your own oxygen on before you can help others. So again, really taking time to find things that can help you on your own self-care to help preserve your own health. And these are just a few examples of things that you can do. And then I'll just wrap up with a few resources. So again, there are quite a few books out there if you're interested in learning more about any of these topics. Certainly check out any of these books, and these are just a sample. There are many, many more examples out there. There are podcasts as well. There's websites that have some great examples, and so you have those resources there. And then I'll just kind of conclude the session really with just taking a moment to just remind people that, we are facing some unprecedented times, right? So even the most resilient people struggle at certain points in time, and COVID-19 has really disrupted our normal routines, and it's created a lot of stress and anxiety. So it's really normal to experience a wide range of emotions. So I want people just to really take away that, you're not alone, and it's okay to experience those emotions. And remember that you need to give yourself and those around you really some grace during this time. And it's really important to reach out, not only to your loved ones, to connect with them, but also if you need support in any way, that reaching out is really not a sign of weakness. It's really one of the most courageous things that you can do, and it's ultimately a sign of strength. So be mindful of your needs during this time, and please, feel free to reach out and seek support if you need to. And this slide provides some additional resources for you. And I would always encourage people that it's always nice to take out your phone and just program some of these prevention lines in, because it may not be you that needs them, but if it's somebody that you care about that needs them as well, it's always nice to have them available so that you can just go right into your contacts and have if you need to. So with that, I will turn it back to Dan.
Thank you, Karla. You've shared a lot of helpful information. I know I personally took a lot away from this, and thank you so much for sharing those resources, including the apps. We do just have a few questions from the group that we can jump right into. The first one is, how does a panic attack different from an elevated distress?
So panic attack is really more just at that moment. And so, it's more of a response to somebody who is feeling a really extreme amount of anxiety. And so you'll start to notice that individuals who are experiencing panic attacks really just need to have somebody come and support them and provide them with, really what do they need? They need to sit down, they need to capture their breath and start practicing some of those. If you think about those mindfulness breathing exercises, really just letting them kind of slow down and practice those breathing exercises to help kind of slow that panic attack down. And it's really essentially something that's going to manifest from somebody who's feeling overwhelmed and starting to feel like stress is a little bit too much for them. And so this is a case where somebody might want to reach out if you have some resources to get some support to start identifying, how do you manage that stress, and getting some tools and resources, whether that's support from workloads, connecting with your coworkers and finding out how do we manage that stress. But it's really around kind of that component. It's a manifestation of somebody who's feeling a little bit overwhelmed at that moment.
Great, thank you. One of our attendees heard that coloring has a similar effect on the brain as meditation. Have you heard this or any other similar activities that mirror meditation?
Coloring is a great way. So really what you're doing is giving your brain just a break, right? So it's kind of that mental pause and that break that your brain needs to kind of step away from all the stress that you're experiencing. And so it really does, because you're being present in that moment, and it's allowing you to kind of shift your focus and focus on being present in that moment in coloring. So absolutely, that's a great way to practice mindfulness and give your brain just a break. So when you think about work every day, and what happens a lot of times is people continue to work, and they work long hours, and they feel like they're going to be more productive if they just work another 15 minutes or another 30 minutes. And by taking these breaks, whether it be a coloring break, you're really just giving your brain a break and an opportunity to kind of pause and re-energize yourself. And so not only is it a good way for mindfulness, but you're going to come back and you end up being more productive because you allowed your body to just kind of take that break. And you may have think about a time where, you were facing a challenge or a struggle that you were working on, and you kind of were stuck and you just couldn't quite find the way to navigate that challenge. Take a break and you come back, and it almost gives you kind of a new perspective, and all of a sudden that challenge doesn't seem quite as challenging as it was when you're kind of to that breakdown kind of burnout point. But coloring is a great opportunity to kind of mimic that mindfulness piece. So great question.
Okay, perfect, thanks. A few of our attendees have asked for more information on the studies you mentioned earlier in your talk. Is there a way that we can share that information or connect on that?
Yeah, I can actually, as a follow-up, Dan, I can just give you some links or information to where some of those studies came from, if that's helpful.
Perfect, that'd be great, and then we'll get that out to our attendees. We'll give them another minute to submit any questions, but I just want to remind everybody that the slide deck was in the initial email with the login information, and we will also be sending the survey and CPE certificates next week. And this will also be available on our YouTube channel for a replay next week. So I do not see any other questions coming in. So in the interest of time, we can go ahead and wrap up today's program. I would like to thank Karla one more time for sharing her thoughts with us today. I encourage all of you to continue to check out our website for additional information and upcoming learning opportunities. I'd especially like to invite you all to next Friday's session on belonging in an unconscious bias. I hope you enjoyed today's program and that I hope you were able to put what you learned into action. Have a great weekend and we'll see you soon.